He told his son he had lost everything. But it was all a test. What happened next exposed a trusted mentor, a hidden fraud, and a betrayal no father ever expected. Watch until the end to discover how one simple lie uncovered the shocking truth. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more powerful stories like this. I still remember the exact moment my son smiled after I told him I was broke. It wasn't a smile of reassurance. It wasn't the kind of smile that says, "We'll figure this out together." It was small, almost impossible to notice unless you were looking directly at him. But I was looking. I had spent 58 years reading people, negotiating contracts, building companies, and surviving industries where one wrong decision could erase decades of work. I knew the difference between relief and compassion. What I saw on Nolan's face that afternoon was relief. My name is Andreas Draven, and everything you're about to hear began because I decided to tell one carefully planned lie. Before anyone judges me, let me explain why. For more than 30 years I owned one of the largest regional freight companies in the Midwest. My work kept me away from home more often than I wanted, but every mile I traveled, every contract I signed, and every sleepless night had one purpose. I wanted my son to have opportunities one never had growing up. I wasn't interested in expensive watches or sports cars. I invested carefully, lived comfortably, and after selling my company years ago, I quietly stepped away from the business world. Most people assumed I was simply a retired businessman enjoying a peaceful life beside a quiet lake. That assumption suited me perfectly because very few people knew the truth. My investments had continued growing, and financially, I had absolutely nothing to worry about. At least, that was true for my bank account. My family was another story. When Nolan was younger, we were inseparable. Every Sunday afternoon he came to the lake house, helped me repair things around the property, and stayed long after dinner just talking about life. We didn't always agree, but we always listened to each other. Somewhere over the past year, that changed so gradually, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. The phone calls became shorter. The visits became less frequent. Conversations that once lasted hours ended after 15 minutes because Nolan suddenly had somewhere else to be. At first, I blamed his growing business. He had launched a technology startup in Chicago, and I knew how demanding entrepreneurship could be. I told myself that success required sacrifice, and perhaps this was simply one of those seasons where work came first. But then I noticed something far more concerning. Every conversation eventually circled back to one person. Kalen Mercer. The first time I heard the name, Nolan described him as a brilliant business mentor who had transformed struggling startups into successful companies. The second time, Nolan quoted him during dinner. Kalen says successful people don't let emotions influence financial decisions. A week later came another quote. Kalen believes family members often become obstacles without realizing it. Then, another. Kalen says loyalty should always follow opportunity. Every sentence began the same way. Kalen says. Kalen believes. Kalen told me. It reached the point where I wondered whether my son still had opinions of his own. I never criticized the man because I had never met him. Maybe he truly was an excellent mentor. Maybe I was simply becoming an overprotective father who struggled to accept that his son no longer needed his advice. I tried convincing myself of that explanation for weeks. Then something happened that I couldn't ignore. 3 weeks before everything fell apart, Nolan invited me to dinner at his apartment in downtown Chicago. The apartment itself was beautiful, far nicer than anything he could have comfortably afforded when he first launched his company. He explained that investors had come aboard, business was expanding, and everything was finally moving in the right direction. I congratulated him. I meant every word. But throughout dinner, I noticed his phone lighting up again and again. Every notification came from the same contact, Kalen. I pretended not to notice the constant messages lighting up Nolan's phone, but each vibration interrupted our conversation at exactly the wrong moment. Every time I asked about his business, his eyes drifted toward the screen before returning to me. It wasn't simply distraction. It felt like he was waiting for permission to answer someone more important than his own father. When dinner ended, he walked me to my car. For a brief moment, I thought I had imagined everything. He thanked me for coming. He hugged me. He even promised to visit the lake house the following weekend. Then his phone buzzed again. Without realizing it, he pulled away from our conversation before I had even opened my car door. "I should take this," he said apologetically. "No problem," I answered. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Instead of watching me leave, Nolan was already speaking animatedly into his phone. That image stayed with me all the way home. During the following week, I couldn't stop thinking about how different he had become. It wasn't just that he was busy. Successful people are often busy. I understood that better than most. The real change was that he no longer questioned anything he was told. Every opinion, every decision, every future plan somehow traced back to Kalen Mercer. That worried me more than I wanted to admit. I decided I needed answers, but asking direct questions would only make Nolan defensive. If someone truly held influence over him, confronting him without evidence would push him even farther away. So I designed a test. It wasn't about money. It was about character. I invited Nolan to spend Saturday afternoon at the lake house, just like we used to years ago. Surprisingly, he accepted without hesitation. The morning was peaceful. We grilled burgers on the back deck, overlooking the water. We talked about fishing, old family vacations, and the baseball games we used to attend together. For a while, everything felt normal again. I almost abandoned my plan. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe all parents eventually struggle to recognize that their children have changed. But after lunch, Nolan casually asked whether I had considered selling the property. The question caught me off guard. "This place is getting harder to maintain," he continued. "You could move somewhere smaller." I looked across the lake before answering. "I've actually been dealing with something else." His expression shifted immediately. "What happened?" I took a slow breath. "I made several terrible investment decisions over the last year." He remained silent. "I lost almost everything." The words hung between us. The wind moved across the lake. A fishing boat passed quietly in the distance. Nolan stared at me without speaking. For several long seconds, I couldn't read his face. Then, almost under his breath, he whispered a single word. "Finally." He seemed to realize he had spoken aloud because his eyes widened for an instant. "What did you say?" I asked calmly. He cleared his throat. "I mean, maybe this is a chance for a fresh start." It wasn't the answer that bothered me. It was the first word. Finally. Why would anyone say, finally, after hearing that their father had supposedly lost everything? I didn't challenge him. Instead, I nodded slowly and changed the subject. The rest of the afternoon felt strangely forced. He asked several questions about my savings. He wanted to know whether I still owned the lake house outright. He wondered if I had outstanding loans. He even asked whether I had updated my will recently. None of those questions sounded like concern. They sounded like an interview. When Nolan finally left that evening, I remained on the porch watching his car disappear down the winding road. Something was terribly wrong. For the first time since creating my little experiment, I realized it might uncover something much darker than simple greed. I walked back inside, locked the front door, and sat alone in the quiet living room. Then I opened a notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote 2 names. Nolan. Kalen Mercer. I had no evidence against either of them. Not yet. But from that moment forward, I promised myself one thing. Every conversation, every unusual request, and every unexpected coincidence would be carefully documented until I discovered exactly why my son had smiled when he thought I had become a poor man. The first call came less than 48 hours after Nolan left the lake house. I had expected him to ask how I was holding up or whether I needed anything. Instead, his voice sounded unusually focused, as though he already had a plan prepared before dialing my number. "Dad, I've been thinking about your situation." "So have I," I replied. "I really think you should start selling assets before things get worse." "What assets?" "The lake house, for starters." I leaned back in my chair and looked through the window at the calm water outside. The property had been fully paid off for years. There were no debts tied to it, no hidden loans, and certainly no creditors waiting to seize it. Yet Nolan spoke as if he already knew a financial disaster was inevitable. "I've lived here a long time," I answered carefully. "I'd rather not rush into anything." There was a pause. "You can't let emotions get in the way of business." The sentence sounded strangely familiar. Not because Nolan had ever spoken that way before. Because I had already heard him repeat almost the exact same words weeks earlier. Kalen says successful people don't let emotions influence financial decisions. Now he wasn't even mentioning Kalen's name anymore. The opinions had become his own. Or at least they sounded that way. We ended the conversation politely, but something inside me became impossible to ignore. My son wasn't reacting naturally. It felt as though every answer had been rehearsed. 3 days later, another call arrived. This time Nolan suggested meeting for coffee in Chicago. "I've got someone who can help organize your finances," he explained. "I appreciate that. He specializes in situations like yours." "What kind of situations?" "Recovering from financial collapse." I almost smiled. If only he knew there had never been any collapse at all. We agreed to meet Friday afternoon. I arrived 20 minutes early and chose a seat facing the entrance of the cafe. Years of negotiating business contracts had taught me one useful habit. If you want to understand a meeting, watch people before they know they're being observed. At exactly 2 o'clock, Nolan entered. He wasn't alone. Walking beside him was a tall man wearing a tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and a smile that looked practiced rather than genuine. His posture radiated confidence without effort. He shook hands with employees as if he had known them for years, even though they barely acknowledged him. Nolan waved toward me. "Dad, I'd like you to meet Kalen Mercer." So this was the man. He looked nothing like the villain I had imagined. If anything, he looked like the type of executive investors trusted immediately. His handshake was firm, his eye contact steady, and his voice carried the calm rhythm of someone accustomed to persuading people for a living. "It's an honor to finally meet you, Mr. Draven," he said warmly. "I've heard a great deal about you." "I hope most of it was true," I answered. He laughed politely. "I'm sure it was." For the next 40 minutes, Kalen controlled almost every part of the conversation. He complimented my career, praised Nolan's intelligence, and spoke confidently about helping families recover after financial setbacks. Not once did he pressure me directly. Instead, he planted ideas. He spoke about simplifying estates, reducing unnecessary expenses, protecting assets before unexpected complications appeared. Everything sounded reasonable. That was what made him dangerous. People rarely fall for obvious lies. They fall for believable truths arranged in the wrong order. As the meeting ended, Kalen reached into his leather briefcase and removed a slim folder. "There are no obligations," he said. "Just some information you may find useful." I accepted it without opening it. When they stood to leave, Nolan excused himself to answer a phone call outside. For a brief moment, I was alone with Kalen. His smile remained perfectly calm. Then he lowered his voice just enough that no one nearby could hear. Successful men know when it's time to let go of the past. Before I could respond, he straightened his tie, smiled again as though nothing unusual had happened, and walked toward the exit. I watched him leave with Nolan. Only after they disappeared onto the sidewalk did I finally open the folder. Inside was far more than financial advice. It contained legal forms that required my signature. I didn't sign a single page. Instead, I carried the folder back to the lake house and spread every document across my dining table. Years earlier, I had reviewed hundreds of contracts while negotiating acquisitions for my freight company. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew enough to recognize when legal language was trying to hide something important beneath harmless-looking paragraphs. The paperwork appeared ordinary at first glance. Asset management agreements. Financial planning disclosures. Power of attorney forms that supposedly allowed temporary assistance during periods of financial hardship. Nothing immediately stood out. Yet something bothered me. Every page referred to urgency. Every recommendation suggested acting quickly. Every signature line encouraged trust before careful review. That alone was enough to make me cautious. The following morning, I drove into town to make copies of every document before placing the originals back into the folder. I had no proof that Kalen intended to deceive me, but instinct told me never to let someone else control the only copy of an agreement. As I left the print shop, my phone rang. It was Nolan. "Dad, did you get a chance to read everything?" I looked through it. "What do you think?" "I think I'd like more time." There was a brief silence. "Time isn't really our friend right now." He hesitated. "I mean, your situation could become more complicated if you wait." Again, that same calm pressure. Never demanding. Always nudging. Always creating the feeling that delay itself was dangerous. "I'll let you know," I answered before ending the call. Later that afternoon, I decided to do something I hadn't planned. Rather than returning directly home, I drove back to Chicago without telling Nolan. I wanted to understand who Kalen Mercer really was outside carefully arranged meetings. After parking several blocks from Nolan's office, I walked through the business district, hoping nothing more than observation might reveal something useful. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then luck intervened. Across the street stood a quiet cafe with large windows facing the sidewalk. As I passed, I recognized Nolan sitting inside at a corner table. He wasn't alone. Kalen sat opposite him with several thick folders spread across the table. Neither of them noticed me. I stepped into a bookstore next door where I could still see through the cafe window without attracting attention. Although I couldn't hear every word through the glass, their body language told its own story. Kalen pointed repeatedly toward different sections of the paperwork. Nolan nodded each time without asking many questions. Then another man joined them briefly, carrying a laptop case. He handed Kalen a sealed envelope before leaving almost immediately. Whatever was inside appeared important because Kalen smiled for the first time since sitting down. A few minutes later, Nolan stood to order coffee. The moment he walked away from the table, Kalen removed several papers from the envelope and slipped them into the folder I recognized from our meeting. He moved quickly, carefully checking that no one nearby seemed interested. That simple action sent a chill through me. Why add documents after presenting the folder to me? When Nolan returned, the papers were already hidden again. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes before both men finally left through separate exits. I waited until they disappeared before crossing the street. I wasn't expecting to find anything. I simply wanted coffee while thinking through everything I had seen. As I approached the counter, a woman seated near the back looked directly at me. "You were watching them too, weren't you?" Her question caught me completely off guard. "I'm sorry." "The man in the navy suit," she continued quietly. "Kalen Mercer." I didn't answer immediately. She closed the notebook resting on her table and stood. "My name is Evelyn Cross." She extended her hand. "I've been trying to prove that man's fraud for almost 2 years." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her bag and removed a photograph. It showed Kalen standing beside another young entrepreneur I had never seen before. Across the bottom of the picture, someone had written 3 words in black ink. "Lost everything afterward." At that moment, I realized my little family test had become something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I stared at the photograph for several seconds before looking back at Evelyn Cross. She wasn't trying to impress me with dramatic claims or exaggerated stories. Her expression remained calm, almost clinical, as though she had repeated the same explanation too many times to too many people who refused to believe her. "You know Kalen?" I asked. "I know what he does," she replied. There was a difference, and she wanted me to understand it. We sat down at a quiet table near the back of the cafe. She ordered black coffee, while I barely touched mine. My attention stayed fixed on the folder she had placed beside the photograph. "I used to work as a financial fraud investigator," Evelyn began. "Most people think fraud looks dramatic. They imagine forged signatures, fake identities, or people disappearing overnight. The reality is much quieter." She opened the folder. "It begins with trust." Inside were copies of contracts, company registrations, and organizational charts connected by handwritten notes. Every page contained the same name: Kalen Mercer. "He doesn't usually steal money directly," she continued. "He convinces ambitious people to sign agreements they don't fully understand. By the time they realize what's happened, the ownership of their companies or properties has already been transferred through holding corporations." I slowly turned another page. Different victims. Different businesses. The legal language changed from case to case, but the structure remained almost identical. "What happened to these people?" I asked. "Some declared bankruptcy. Some spent years fighting in court. A few gave up completely because they couldn't afford legal fees." "And you couldn't stop him?" She sighed. "Suspicion isn't evidence." That sentence stayed with me. She explained that every victim had willingly signed documents. Kalen never forced anyone. He simply buried dangerous clauses beneath dozens of pages of legitimate legal language. Everything appeared voluntary until the consequences surfaced months later. I finally understood why every conversation with him had felt so carefully controlled. He wasn't selling contracts. He was selling confidence. "What about my son?" I asked quietly. Evelyn looked at me for a long moment before answering. "I don't think Nolan knows what he's involved in." "You sound certain." "I've watched him during 3 different meetings over the past month." That caught me completely by surprise. "You've been following them?" "I've been following Kalen." She reached into her folder again and removed several printed photographs taken outside office buildings, restaurants, and conference centers. Nolan appeared in many of them, always listening attentively while Kalen spoke. "Your son doesn't behave like a partner," Evelyn said. "He behaves like someone who genuinely believes he's learning from a mentor." I leaned back in my chair. For the first time since beginning this test, anger gave way to something else. Concern. If Evelyn was right, Nolan wasn't helping Kalen because he wanted to betray me. He was being manipulated by someone far more experienced. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We gather proof." "How?" She smiled slightly. "By giving Kalen exactly what he expects." Over the next hour, we developed a plan. I would continue pretending to be financially desperate. I would ask questions without appearing suspicious. Most importantly, I would never refuse meetings or paperwork outright. Instead, I would encourage Kalen to explain every recommendation in greater detail. "The more confident he becomes," Evelyn explained, "the more likely he'll reveal how the structure actually works." Before leaving the cafe, she handed me a small digital voice recorder no larger than a pack of chewing gum. "Carry this during every meeting." I turned it over in my hand. "You really think he'll slip up?" "No." She stood and gathered her files. "I think he'll become comfortable." There was confidence in her voice, but not arrogance. She had seen people like Kalen before. As we walked toward the exit, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Nolan. "Dad, Kalen has updated the paperwork. He'd like to meet again next Tuesday. He says the new version will make everything much easier for you." I read the message twice before slipping my phone back into my pocket. Evelyn glanced at me. "Looks like he just made the first move." I nodded slowly. So now, I said, it's our turn. The days leading up to Tuesday felt unusually long. Every conversation with Nolan sounded polite, but I could hear an urgency in his voice that hadn't existed before. He called twice to confirm I would attend the meeting. He reminded me to bring identification and the previous set of documents. He even asked whether I had spoken to anyone else about my financial situation. I answered carefully each time, making sure I sounded like a worried father searching for guidance rather than someone quietly preparing an investigation. Meanwhile, Evelyn and I stayed in close contact. We met at a small public library on the edge of Chicago where private study rooms could be reserved without attracting attention. She examined every page of the paperwork Kaylin had already given me and compared it with contracts collected from former victims. The similarities became impossible to ignore. The wording changes, she explained while placing two documents side by side, but the structure never does. She highlighted several paragraphs with colored tabs. This clause appears harmless because it mentions temporary asset protection. But notice the cross-reference. I leaned closer. The paragraph referred to another section nearly 20 pages later. That section redirected authority to an outside holding company under specific financial conditions. And those conditions? I asked. They're vague on purpose, Evelyn replied. The company itself decides whether those conditions exist. I frowned. So the company creates the problem and then claims the right to solve it. She nodded. Exactly. The company listed in the documents had an ordinary name that revealed nothing unusual. Evelyn searched through a collection of public business records she had already gathered. Several shell companies eventually connected back to the same corporate address. Different names. Different directors. One controlling network. Every trail ended with businesses linked to Kaylin Mercer. What about Nolan? I asked quietly. He never appears as an owner. I felt a small sense of relief. So he really doesn't know? I believe he thinks he's helping people recover financially. Her answer wasn't proof, but it matched everything I had observed. Nolan had become confident, impatient, and overly trusting, yet he had never behaved like someone intentionally trying to destroy another person. He looked more like someone repeating lessons without questioning the teacher. Tuesday finally arrived. The meeting was scheduled inside a modern office building overlooking the Chicago River. The reception area looked expensive without feeling excessive. Soft music played through hidden speakers. Framed awards covered one wall. Everything about the place encouraged confidence. Before entering the conference room, I switched on the tiny recorder Evelyn had given me and slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket. Nolan greeted me with a smile. You made it. I said I would. He seemed relieved. Kaylin entered a moment later carrying another leather portfolio. Mr. Draven, he said warmly, I've simplified everything. He placed the revised paperwork neatly in front of me. This version removes unnecessary complications. I slowly turned the first page. The language appeared cleaner than before. Shorter paragraphs. Fewer legal references. It looked easier to understand. That alone made me suspicious. As Kaylin explained each section, I interrupted politely with simple questions. What exactly does this company manage? Why is this authorization necessary? What happens if I change my mind 6 months from now? Each answer sounded smooth. Each explanation avoided direct specifics. Whenever I requested a clear yes or no response, Kaylin redirected the conversation toward convenience, efficiency, or future security. Nolan watched silently, occasionally nodding as though every explanation made perfect sense. Nearly an hour passed before I reached the final signature page. Kaylin slid a silver pen across the table. If you're comfortable moving forward, he said, we can finalize everything today. I picked up the pen. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then I looked directly at Kaylin. I have one last question. He smiled confidently. Of course. If this agreement is truly designed to protect me. I closed the folder without signing it. Why does every version you've shown me quietly increase your company's control while reducing mine? For the first time since we met, the smile disappeared from Kaylin Mercer's face.